My name is Harold Beecham, and at 62, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a man my age was a bad knee or a bad diagnosis. Then on a Thursday afternoon in October, I stood in line at my credit union to deposit a check from selling my late wife's wedding ring, something I'd put off for 2 years, and the manager came out from behind the glass office, touched my elbow and said, "Mr. Beecham, can we speak somewhere private?" The account that was supposed to hold what was left of 40 years of marriage, the life insurance, the sale of our house in Dayton when I downsized, nearly $400,000, had $9.12 in it. Before I tell you how I got from that line at the credit union to where I am now, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, and in the comments tell me where you're watching from and how old your own kids are. I read every one of them, and lately they're the closest thing I have to company in the evenings. Let me take you back 6 months before that Thursday, because you need to understand how a man hands his whole life to someone without ever feeling the hand close around it. My wife, Margaret, died of pancreatic cancer 18 months before any of this started. 39 years married, and I'd never once balanced a checkbook, never once called the insurance company, never once known which drawer held the deed to the house. She did all of it quietly, the way she did everything. And when she was gone, I sat at our kitchen table with a stack of mail I didn't understand and felt about as useful as a man can feel. That's when my daughter Renee started coming around. Renee was 48, divorced, working the early shift at a diner off Route 4, and she showed up at my door 3 days after the funeral with a casserole and a legal pad. "Dad," she said, "we're going to figure this out together." She sat with me for 6 straight evenings going through Margaret's files, learning the bill pay system, calling the bank to get my name properly on everything. She never once made me feel like an old fool, even when I genuinely was one. She drove 40 minutes each way to do it, and she never sent a bill for her time, never hinted she expected anything back. My son Bradley lived in Charlotte, 2 states south, with a job in commercial real estate and a wife who posted vacation photos every other week. Bradley called on Sundays, usually for 15 minutes, usually ending with, "Let me know if you need anything, Dad." He came up for the funeral and left the next morning because of a closing he couldn't push back. I didn't blame him for it. Men build their lives where the work is, and Bradley had always been the one with the head for numbers. He'd helped me refinance the house once, walked me through it over the phone like it was nothing, and I remember thinking, that boy's got Margaret's patience and my stubbornness. What a combination. So when the cardiologist found the blockage that spring, nothing dramatic, just enough to put a stent in and put the fear of God in me. It was Bradley who called first after the procedure, and Bradley who said the thing that changed everything. "Dad, listen, if anything ever happens fast, you don't want Renee scrambling at a bank counter trying to prove who she is. You should put a second name on the main account. Somebody who can act quick if you can't. I do this kind of paperwork every day. Let me help you set it up right." I want to be honest with you. My first thought wasn't Bradley. My first thought was Renee, because Renee was the one who'd been here, the one who knew the password to the cable bill, and which pharmacy delivered. But Bradley had the same blood, the same right, and some old part of me, maybe pride, maybe just wanting to believe my son cared as much as my daughter did, wanted to give him a way to prove it, and he was the one with the financial head. It made sense on paper. Everything Bradley says makes sense on paper. He flew up for a weekend in May, sat across from me at the credit union with a folder of forms he'd already half filled out, and walked me through it line by line, patient as a school teacher. Joint ownership, right of survivorship, the works. Renee wasn't there. I didn't think to ask her to be. I told myself I'd tell her after, and then I forgot, the way you forget things at 62 that you'd have remembered at 40. For the next 5 months, nothing seemed wrong. Statements came. I glanced at the balance. It looked about right, and I went back to my crossword. I wasn't a man who studied numbers. Margaret had handled that for 39 years, and I'd never developed the habit of suspicion you're supposed to have about your own money. It was Renee who noticed first, though not the way you'd think. She'd started picking up my mail for me on the days I had physical therapy, mostly so the mailbox wouldn't overflow and announce to the whole street that an old man lived alone. One Tuesday in September, she came in with the stack and said, almost as an aside, "Dad, did you open a new card with Sapphire Trust? There's a statement here addressed to you, but I don't recognize the account number." I hadn't opened anything. I told her it was probably a mistake, a misprint, junk mail dressed up to look official. She set it on the counter and didn't push, because that was Renee. She noticed things and then waited to see if they mattered before she made a fuss. It mattered. 3 weeks later was the day at the credit union with the ring. The manager, a younger woman named Patricia who'd only been there a year, walked me back to her office and turned her monitor so I could see it myself. 11 withdrawals over 5 months. 2 wire transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The largest single withdrawal, $41,000, dated the same week. Bradley had texted me a photo of a kitchen renovation in his house in Charlotte with the caption, "Finally doing it right." "Mr. Beecham," Patricia said, "do you recognize any of these transactions?" I sat there with Margaret's ring sale check, still in my coat pocket, and felt something in my chest that wasn't my heart acting up. Though for a second I genuinely thought it might be. I said no. I said no to every single line on that screen. Here's the part I'm not proud of. My first thought wasn't Bradley, it was Renee. She was the one who handled my mail, who knew my passwords, who'd sat with me at that kitchen table going through Margaret's files for 6 evenings before anyone else had lifted a finger. I drove home that afternoon, turning it over and over. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd half convinced myself my own daughter, the one who showed up every single week without being asked, had been quietly bleeding me dry, while I sat there congratulating myself on having such a devoted child. I called her before I'd even taken my coat off. I didn't accuse her outright. I'm not that kind of man, or at least I like to think I'm not. But I asked her, flat out, if she knew anything about money moving out of the main account. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that my stomach dropped clean through the floor. "Dad," she finally said, "I don't have access to that account. I'm not on it. You never added me." I'd forgotten. In the chaos of Margaret's death and my own recovery, I had genuinely, completely forgotten that the name on that account wasn't Renee's at all. It was Bradley's. I sat down hard on the kitchen chair, the same one I'd sat in the night after the funeral, with that stack of unopened mail. And I felt about as foolish as a man can feel at 62 years old. Renee drove the 40 minutes over before I'd even hung up the phone, and she didn't say "I told you so," didn't say anything close to it. She just sat with me and asked, "What do you actually know, Dad?" "Not what you assume. What do you know?" What I knew was this. There were 11 withdrawals, 2 wires, and a renovated kitchen in Charlotte with a caption that suddenly didn't sit right in my stomach. I called Bradley that night. I kept my voice level, the way you do when you're 48 hours from either being right or being the worst father in America for even thinking it. I told him about the meeting at the credit union, the 11 withdrawals, and I asked him, plainly, if he knew anything about it. He didn't deny it right away. That's the part that still sits with me. There was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause where you can hear someone deciding which version of the truth to give you. Then he said the market had been brutal, that the real estate firm had cut his commission structure in half that spring, that the renovation was supposed to increase the resale value of the house so he could sell it before things got worse, that he'd always intended to pay it back before I ever noticed, that he never imagined I'd need the money this soon because I barely spent anything anyway. I asked him the only question that mattered to me. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" He didn't answer that one, not directly. He talked instead about how stressful the last 2 years had been for him, watching his marriage strain under financial pressure he hadn't told anyone about. How he'd meant to ask me properly, but didn't want to, seemed like he was coming to his grieving father with his hand out. How the joint account had just been sitting there, and it felt in the moment like borrowing rather than stealing. "I want you to understand something. I am not a man who throws his children away. I raised Bradley to believe that asking for help wasn't weakness. And somewhere along the way I think I failed to teach him that taking without asking is a different thing entirely. A thing with a different name. But $41,000 does not get spent on a kitchen by accident. 11 withdrawals over 5 months is not an emergency. It's a pattern. The kind of pattern a man builds when he's decided something belongs to him before anyone's agreed to give it. The week after that phone call, I drove out to the credit union with Renee beside me. She insisted on coming, and for once I let her, and Patricia walked us through removing Bradley from the account entirely. As the original sole funder, with the original account history showing every dollar that had ever gone into it before Bradley's name was added, I had every right to revoke his access without a court order. Patricia also flagged the wire transfers for the credit union's internal fraud review. since two of them had gone out within 24 hours of each other, in a pattern the bank's own systems should have caught and hadn't. I won't pretend the next part was clean or fast. I hired a lawyer, an older man named Philip Soto, who'd handled Margaret's estate paperwork, and who looked at the statements for about 90 seconds before he said, "Mr. Beecham, this isn't a gray area, this is theft, and I think you know that." I didn't press criminal charges. I thought about it for 2 full weeks, sitting with the idea of my son in handcuffs, and I couldn't get there. Not yet, maybe not ever. What I did instead was send Bradley a formal demand for repayment with a structured timeline, drafted by Philip, plain and unemotional as a phone bill. 41,000 of the total has been repaid as of this writing, in monthly installments that arrive like clockwork now, which tells me he always had the means to pay it back honestly and simply chose not to. Bradley and I talk maybe once a month now. It's polite, it's careful. There's a version of our relationship that might come back someday. Once the debt is settled and enough time has passed, that the betrayal isn't the only thing sitting at the table between us. But I won't lie to you and tell you it's there yet. Renee, for her part, never once asked to be put on the account. When Philip drew up new paperwork and asked who I wanted listed this time, I said her name without hesitation, and she actually argued with me about it. Said she didn't want it to look like she'd been angling for this the whole time. Said her showing up every week had never been about money, and she didn't want anyone, including me, ever wondering otherwise. I told her I knew that better than anyone alive, and I added her anyway. Because a man who's been fooled once in his life owes it to himself to finally put his trust where it was earned instead of where it was assumed. I think about that morning in the credit union office more than I'd like to admit. Patricia turning the monitor toward me. $9.12 where 400,000 used to be. But what I think about almost as much is the drive home afterward, the version of that drive where I'd let myself believe, even for an hour, that it was Renee who'd done this to me. The daughter who'd never once asked me for a dime, who'd sat at my kitchen table 6 evenings in a row, teaching an old man how to read his own mail, who I was ready to suspect simply because she was the one standing closest when the trouble started. I've come to believe something in the months since, and I'll leave you with it, because I think it matters more than the money ever did. The child who shows up quietly, week after week, with no folder of forms, and no explanation for why they deserve your trust, is very often the one who's earned it most, and the one who hands you the paperwork, who makes it all sound reasonable, who has an answer ready for every question before you've finished asking it. That's not proof of love. Sometimes it's just proof of practice.